Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to another session of the Epiverse training webinar series. My name is Diana Fajardo, and I am Epiverse's Community Engagement Manager. Today, we will showcase EpiNow2, AR package developed in collaboration between the Epiverse team and the epiforecasts research group at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Let me clear my screen. Before we start, I would like you to know that as a community, Epiverse is dedicated to providing a harassment-free, inclusive, and welcoming environment for all participants, regardless of gender identity or expression, age, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, or lack thereof, socioeconomic status, or education level. We prioritize the safety and well-being of marginalized individuals and communities over the comfort of those in position of privilege. Maintaining the integrity and inclusiveness of our community is a shared responsibility. I also would like you to know that this webinar is being recorded and we will be sharing all presentation slides by email. If you have issues sharing your identity in the recording, please change your name and photo. Due to the number of participants, your microphones have been disabled. All messages from speakers and links to resources will be shared in the chat. And at the end of both presentations, we will have time for discussions. Please use the Q&A box located in the toolbar to post your questions. Without any further delay, I will present our first speaker. I welcome James Hassan. James is a research software engineer with the Epiverse team. He is an infectious disease modeler by training based at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He leads and supports the development of open source R packages. And his work is focused on outbreak response analytics in low and middle income settings. James is a co-author of EpiNow2 package, and he will share insights into its development and functionalities. Welcome, James, and over to you.
Okay, I'll share my screen now. Sorry for the hiccup. Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to present on EpiNow2. So I'll try to quickly walk you through some of the features. It's a feature-rich package that will be difficult to walk through in a very short time. So I'll try my best. My name is James Hassan. As introduced, I'm a research software engineer with the Epiverse TRACE Initiative. I'll start by providing some background into why EpiNow2 is important. So during outbreaks, monitoring and evaluation depends on available or reported data. So often we only have data on cases, hospitalizations, and deaths, but the reported cases are often a tip of the iceberg. So often we've not observed the true underlying process. So here I'm showing, for example, an Mpox outbreak that points out that the last few days of data are not reliable, for example. Some of the issues with reporting data is that when you've observed the data, you've not actually observed the most recent data. So cases that are supposed to be hospitalized or that will proceed to be put in ICU admission or go on to die or recover will not have been shown in the data, especially in the most recent data. And methods that allow us to make analytics decisions around the data that we're observing and to make decisions, public health decisions, will often lack that information. A better way to monitor outbreaks and evaluate them is to use the time varying reproduction number, which is defined as the average number of secondary infections caused by each infectious individual at a specific time in a population where some individuals may not be susceptible. And RT estimation can account for these delays that I mentioned, and in so doing, reveal variations in transmissibility. And when you do that, you can use it to retrospectively and in real time assess whether an outbreak is increasing or decreasing or steady. So how do you estimate RT? A common framework that people use is the renewal model, which basically estimates RT as the current infections at time t divided by previous infections scaled by their generation time, which is a measure of their infectiousness. So this simple framework is often used in a lot of packages. And it's simple because it only requires reported cases, data on reported cases, and a specification of the generation time distribution. And this is what has been implemented in EpiNow2 that I'll be introducing to you here. So now on to EpiNow2. What does EpiNow2 do? It can estimate, forecast, and simulate. So it can estimate infections, time-varying reproduction numbers, secondary outcomes like hospitalizations and deaths, and the growth rate and rate and doubling time. And you can also use it to simulate infection trajectories, especially for scenario analysis, and to simulate secondary outcomes like hospitalizations and deaths. For the sake of time, I'll only talk about the estimation feature. EpiNow2 takes great care in implementing well-researched best practices for estimating RT, which includes accounting for delays from infection to reporting, delays from infection to symptom onset, and so on and so forth, accounting for right truncation where data that is destined to happen has not yet been appeared in the data. So for example, cases that will eventually become hospitalizations will not have already been shown in the data in the most recent part of the data, and EpiNow2 accounts for that. It also accounts for incomplete data and allows for you to specify uncertain generation time distributions and smoothing windows to account for effects like day of the week effects in data. Under the hood, EpiNow2 basically uses the STAN programming language that allows you to specify models probabilistically. It allows you to access two STAN backends, the RSTAN package and the command STAN out package, and it fits the models with STAN's MCMC algorithms while also providing unstable but faster non-MCMC methods like variational inference, Laplace, and Pathfinder. So I'll now walk you through some of EpiNow2's functionalities grouped by the main function. So the estimation functions begin with estimate. So estimate infections, as the name implies, allows you to estimate infections and time-varying reproduction number from the reported cases. Estimate secondary allows you to estimate secondary outcomes like hospitalizations, deaths from observed cases. And we also have a function called estimate truncation, which allows you to estimate the right truncation distribution from recent vintage and snapshot data, which you can then use to correct for the incompleteness of the recent data. There's also forecasting functions that allow you to forecast infections and secondary outcomes. They begin with forecast. And there's also simulation functions that begin with simulate. For the sake of time, I'll only talk about the estimation functions. So there's a general workflow for working with EpiNow2, and we provide a vignette for doing that. So if you visit the EpiNow2 website, there's a vignette called Estimate Infections Workflow that walks you through that, which is what I'll walk you through here. So the key first input is the data, which is a data frame of observations. It's expected to be complete by day, so the dates must be complete. And the second column is called confirm, which contains the number of cases. So if you have this, you are good to go. The other arguments and inputs are mostly specified as priors and distributions, and they all have associated underscore ops functions. So for example, you specify the generation time distribution with the generation time ops function. We recognize that that's quite a long name, so we've shortened it to GT ops. You can specify it as either of them and you'll be fine. You specify delays with delay ops, and you specify observations with the observation model with ops. There's other ops that I've not mentioned here, but these are just to highlight some of them. So as I mentioned previously, you specify most of the interface using distributions. Currently, we've implemented the normal, log normal, gamma, fixed, and non-parametric distributions for passing distributions to EpiNow2 because it requires a bit of processing in the background before it is passed to the STAN language. So an example of how to specify an uncertain distribution is you call the gamma function, which if you've loaded EpiNow2, it recognizes, and then you pass an uncertain distributions for the parameters. So the shape and rates here are assigned normal distributions, and all the distributions have a max. You can plot the distribution, and you can see it here where we show the cumulative function as well as the probability mass function, and you can see that uncertainty around it. Here's an example where we specify a fixed distribution. So the shape and rate are fixed numbers. So you just pass numbers to it, and when you plot it, you just have single lines showing that there's no uncertainty around the distribution. So to showcase all of that, I've talked about the inputs, the data, and the arguments. Now I'll walk you through some of the model showcases. So let's talk about the estimate infections model. It has two types of models. It has the mechanistic model, which uses the renewal equation, which I mentioned earlier. And it also has a non-mechanistic model, which basically removes the prior on how RT evolves over time. This will make more sense when I show you the code. So the function signature of EpiNow2 estimates infections looks like this. You have a lot of arguments, and we recommend you take some time trying to understand what each of them do. They're all functions that you can call the help on, and you will get the help file and see the default values, which you can change. So for estimate infections, let me walk you through some simple code. So you start by loading the package, and very importantly, for STAN, you need to call options MC cores. Here, I'm trying to detect the number of cores on my machine. And I'm going to be using 4 cores. So I'll try and find the minimum of the number of cores on my machine as well as 4. So STAN will pick that up and use it for parallel processing for faster model runs. And then I'm going to load the example confirmed data that comes with the package. It's the same as the data I showed you previously. I'll specify the generation time as an uncertain gamma distribution and the incubation period as an uncertain log normal distribution. And I'll also specify the reporting delay, which is a fixed distribution centered around 2. And then I'll specify a prior for RT. Here I'm saying it's a log normal that is also centered around 2. So when I have all that, I can pass it to estimate infections, and basically the distributions I specified can be passed to the associated ops functions. We have methods in place internally to check that you are passing the right thing to the right argument. One thing to note here is that you can do convolutions with reporting delays. So you can actually combine 2 delays. So here we are combining the incubation period and the reporting delay into one delay using the plus symbol, which is also specially implemented in EpiNow2. So when you run this model, you can call summary on the object, and it prints out this table that tells you the number of infections per day, the expected change in reports, whether the cases are likely to be decreasing or increasing or stable, and it gives you an estimate of the effective reproduction number, and so on and so forth, all with credible intervals around them. It also returns a ggplot object. You can just call plot on it, and it returns this panel plot, which has reports over time on the top axis, new infections per day in the middle axis, and effective reproduction number on the bottom axis. And it splits the data in terms of which estimates are based on complete data, which ones are on partial data, that's partially observed data, and which part of the estimates are forecast. And since they're ggplot objects, you can actually deconstruct it or customize it to your needs. One thing to note is that I only ran the default model. A lot of the arguments I did not change. But the default model is customizable. So some of the notable customizations include using the non-mechanistic model, where instead of specifying an RT prior, you just set it to null and it will use the non-mechanistic model. You can also turn off the Gaussian process that is used to smooth the estimates. And you can turn off adjusting for delays, which will give you a model that is equivalent to the one that is used by EpiEstim, for those who are familiar with the EpiEstim R package. So here I'm going to use the previous code. The only thing I'm doing here is setting RT equals to null. This model is extremely fast compared to the default model, and it works very well when you do not have any incomplete data. So when you're doing retrospective analysis, you would want to use the non-mechanistic model, for example. That as well, you can pass the summary function to it, and you get a summary. You can plot it, and so on and so forth. One feature that I'm very excited about that is quite recent is the ability to model temporally aggregated data. So if you have data that is aggregated in terms of weeks or months or irregular intervals, you can actually model it with EpiNow2. So for that, you need to add a new column to your data that is called accumulates, and that tells the model to accumulate all missing observations as modeled values, and then it sums them up into the dates that are observed. We provide a function called fill missing that allows you to do that. So here I'm loading weekly data, which I plot here. So instead of daily data, I have weekly data, as you can see. And to pass it to EpiNow2, first I call the fill missing function on it. I tell it that missing dates should be accumulated. So they should be modeled as though they were present and then accumulated to the observed date. And missing observations should also be accumulated. So it produces this data frame that says these dates were missing, but we're going to model them. But when we get to a date that was observed, we're going to sum the previous modeled values and place it here, and so on and so forth. So the only thing I'm going to do here is to pass it to estimate infections, keeping all the arguments the same. And you can get a summary out of it. And here you see the plot is quite different because the observed data in weeks, but the modeled values can be continuous. And it's the same for new infections per day and the reproduction number. So that's for estimating infections. That's quite a lot of functionality already. You can also estimate secondary observations from primary observations. I'll walk you through the functions. There's not enough time to talk about the function signature for estimate secondary, but it's quite similar to estimate infections. So here I'm loading in data, and the requirement here is that the data should have a column called primary that contains the primary events, let's say cases, and then secondary that contains secondary observations that are derived from primary. So for example, cases that become hospitalized or cases that die. And the function will estimate the relationship between these two and allow you to forecast and do other fancy things. So here, for the example I'm showing you, I'm looking at incidence relationship where deaths are resulting from cases. So for that, I just pass the data that I have that has the primary and secondary columns. The key thing here is to call secondary ops that has the type set to incidence. And then I put a prior on the observation model that allows me to scale the primary observations into secondary observations. And the plots, you can call plot on the object, and it looks like that. You can also model prevalence relationships. So for example, cases becoming hospital admissions. So the cases keep growing over time. Some are being removed, but some remain. That as well, you have the same data set that I loaded previously with the primary and secondary. Here, the only change is that I'm calling secondary ops, but with there's a mistake, but I should say type should be prevalence, and you'll get a distribution that looks like that models the secondary observations as a prevalence instead of incidence. So in summary, EpiNow2 provides a flexible and powerful framework for estimating the real-time reproduction number and forecasting infectious disease trends. The package supports both mechanistic and non-mechanistic models, allowing users to choose the best approach for their data. And one key take home that I want you to have is that you should go beyond the default. So the default model was set up during COVID for real-time data analysis, but post-COVID, when outbreaks are no longer in real time, if you're analyzing retrospective complete data, you should look at the non-default models and also explore various optimizations, like the number of cores you have on your machine, and using non-default models that are faster than the default model, which people often complain about. So there's various resources for the package. There's a function reference, there's vignettes that define the math behind the models, the workflow, and model options and customizations. And there's many applications. If you search on Google Scholar for EpiNow2, you'll find many applications in public health. For example, Kelly's talk that will be given right after this. So I'd like to acknowledge the core developers, Professor Funk and Dr. Sam Abbott, EpiNow2 contributors, Epiverse TRACE, epiforecast, and everyone who's been contributing. Thank you, and I'm open to some questions.
Thank you so much, James, for this great presentation. We will have time to respond your questions at the end. Now we're going to continue with Kelly Charnigal. Well, Kelly is a friend of the house. She is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institut Pasteur in Paris. She is a PhD in infectious disease epidemiology from the Imperial College London. And she's a former prevention effectiveness fellow at the US CDC, where she also supported the CDC's response to the 2022 multinational mpox outbreak as a member of the modeling team at Deputy Lead. She currently researches in mathematical modeling of infectious diseases. Kelly is here to share with us her experience using EpiNow2 in the real life public health scenarios for crisis response. So Kelly, over to you.
Thanks, Diana. Let me share my screen. Okay, before I start, I want to give a disclaimer. So I don't currently work with the CDC and am speaking today in a personal capacity. I don't represent CDC or the US government. And okay, now that we have that out of the way, I want to thank James for his presentation. I think it makes my life a little bit easier. And it is nice knowing that people are still interested in this work, given that it happened 3 years ago. And it's also nice to see all the cool developments that they've made to EpiNow2 since I've used it. So also to mention that the work that I'm talking about is published in Epidemics, and I think someone will provide the link in the chat or afterwards. So if you're interested in learning more about our reflections, you can read about it here. There is also a link to the code, but I don't think it will run because of how EpiNow2 has been restructured since we did this work. So, but you can look at it if you're interested anyway. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the background for the epidemic and the rationale for this work. I'll talk about how we used EpiNow2 and specifically what we had to consider when we were running the package. I'll talk about challenges and successes, how the results were communicated to public health officials and decision makers. Then I'll get into the weeds a little bit with the performance evaluation and then some takeaways. Okay, so so let's think back to 3 years ago. Mpox was the first major epidemic since COVID, and so there was quite a lot of interest and attention on it. But you have to remember that we weren't starting in the same place as we were for COVID. Mpox was not a novel disease. We had known about it for decades, and so we did have some research to work off of. Granted, this was a disease that was behaving in a different way and also appearing in different regions of the world for the first time. But know that we didn't start from scratch. The first cases were in the 1970s. We knew that it's an orthopox virus, so it's in the same family as smallpox. It is a zoonotic disease that is endemic in parts of Africa. And there have been 2 clades. Clade 1, with a historically higher case fatality rate, formerly known as the Congo Basin, which tended to circulate in Central Africa. And then you had Clade 2, formerly the West African clade, which tended to circulate there with a historically lower case fatality rate. And so here we're talking about Clade 2, 3 years ago. So this is kind of how the outbreak played out. So many of you who work on infectious diseases are probably familiar with this, but just in case, because I think there's a lot of people on the call, I don't know most of you, so I'll just briefly go through kind of where we were at. So the first cases were reported in the UK in May of 2022. The disease later spread to 110 countries or territories, which led to over 86,000 cases, over 100 deaths, and the most affected people were gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men. In the US, we had a little bit of lead time. So our first case was reported on May 18th, and then it later spread to all states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. We had over 30,000 cases and 38 deaths, so one of the most affected countries in this outbreak. James talked a lot about it, but I just want to reiterate what nowcasting is and how I think about it. So what it is estimating the number of events on a given day that have yet to be reported. So usually we're talking about cases, but it could be deaths or hospitalizations. And how I also think about it is kind of adjusting the epidemic curve. So if you look at an epidemic curve during an outbreak, during like a real-time situation, an outbreak, it's always going to be biased downwards. It's always going to look more optimistic than things are because of those reporting delays. Things have happened that you're not seeing yet. And so why this work was so important, because even after COVID, I still saw people kind of squinting at an epi curve thinking, oh, I think it's going down. You can't say, so this is why you need to adjust for it, because you can't really rely on those most recent data. And I think every outbreak, I think we're getting closer to people really understanding that. And so again, why we're doing this is for situational awareness. So this is a picture of the Emergency Operations Center at CDC, where you have these big monitors where people are kind of watching the situation in different countries. And yeah, so for situation awareness, so that you can take decisions to control the outbreak. And so in the early days, we recognized that it was going to be important to estimate RT and have some kind of nowcasting set up. For perspective, this was my first time ever doing real-time analysis. So my PhD was on outbreaks, and specifically on vector-borne disease outbreaks in Colombia, hence the connection. I've been working with these folks for a while at Javeriana, but I had never done anything in real time. And so I wasn't super comfortable coding something up from scratch because one, I had never done it before, but also I didn't have really senior modeling support, especially in the early days. So in a way, I was kind of relying on my previous connections and, some other colleagues, but I was much more comfortable in this situation, picking something off the shelf that I knew was reliable and tested and something I could have more confidence in. So we considered 3 packages at the beginning, and I'm going to talk a little bit through the pros and cons of each one. So we looked at EpiEstim, EarlyR, and EpiNow2. And so what's nice about EpiEstim is that it accounts for importations, which in the early days of Mpox was quite a big deal. You had a lot of cases coming in from other countries and then from other states. Unfortunately, you need cases by date of symptom onset. And as we'll see, as the outbreak kind of moves along, you tend to get less completeness in those dates. Then we looked at EarlyR, which is fast, simple, and good when data are sparse. I think it uses maximum likelihood estimation. So it's, like I said, pretty fast, but it's not great after the early phase. You have to kind of use something else. And then EpiNow2, it incorporates multiple sources of uncertainty, but it is slower compared to the other methods. And at least for me, there was a steep learning curve. So maybe now that's a bit better. They have James and others working on it and having better vignettes, but there were certain things which I'll talk about, which we kind of struggled with and had to actually reach out to Sam Abbott to get some clarification on. Okay, so here's a little bit in the weeds about what we had to account for. So in our data, we had 2 reference dates. So remember, we're always interested in the time of infection, but you never observe that. So you try to get as close as possible. So for us, symptom onset date was when people first got a rash. Okay. And then we had an event date, which was essentially when we knew about it, because the CDC is at the federal, the national level, but we have 50 states and the territories. And so they all are sending data to us, and they all have kind of different systems and timelines for doing so. And so we'd have to account for that delay. Then we accounted for right truncation by essentially just moving the most recent 4 to 5 days from the time series. There are other ways you can do this with the estimate truncation function, which is where we kind of struggled with. One, understanding how the function worked in the documentation, but also the fact that we didn't have snapshots for large portions of the outbreak, so we couldn't really use the function. And then we did have some serial interval and incubation period estimates, but they were from previous outbreaks or other clades. And so we used what we had and then just updated those when we got better estimates for the current outbreak. And we used a pretty short forecast horizon of 7 days. So when you think about it, we're removing the most recent data and we have a 7 days forecast. So essentially it was a forecast of 2 days, which is essentially an outcast. So here's some challenges that we had to work through. Like I mentioned, the timing and frequency of reporting varied. We had things called, I'm going to call bulk uploads, which essentially you haven't heard from a state for a while, and then they send you all the cases at the same time. And so you'd have these kind of weird spikes in data, and you'd have to sort out whether it's an artifact or what else could be going on. Then you had data completeness, which was changing over time. We needed some key epi parameters that we didn't currently have the most up-to-date data for. And then we had case data reconciliation. So this was not a great part of the outbreak in my memory. What essentially happened was you had changing data streams from a longer case report form with many questions to a shorter one. And during that time, which was around the peak, we basically didn't have access to data to do nowcasting, reliable data. So we could tell you how many cases there were, but we didn't have good line list data to do the nowcasting. So for the key time period where we should have been doing it, we didn't have access to data. And I have read other CDC reports from other outbreaks or even kind of seasonal work that they're doing for things like respiratory viruses. And I've seen this happen. So it's clearly something that we noted and maybe still needs to be fixed in the future. So even if you have great tools, you still need good, reliable data coming in. Here are some successes that we had. So we were able to quickly identify and investigate data errors, and that was by working with the different data teams. And then we had this data completeness issue, but when we reached out to jurisdictions to tell us, to explain to them why it was so important, we did get improvements in the data completeness and the quality. And then we used GitHub to share and collaborate on code. So I think at one time there were maybe 70 people using it, which was kind of a big success. If you know anything about government, a lot of people are maybe not using R or not using the kind of necessarily the latest tools. And so this was a big achievement because you could see all the different teams, what their analyses were, what their pipelines were. And so this was a good success. Now, I think the bit that you're kind of most interested in is what is the policy impact? A lot of times, even within the government, we put out these things and we're not exactly sure how they're used. I mean, if you're not in the room, you don't know. So I could tell you that at some point the CDC director was interested in RT estimates, but I was never directly in the room with her. So I can tell you how we put it out. And then after that, it's not always super clear how it influences decision making. But in any case, we had both internal and external routes for our estimates, for our nowcasting and our RT estimates. So internally, we shared them in situational reports. So these are reports that regularly go out to everyone working in the outbreak response, so they kind of know what's happening. They were also shared at leadership meetings. So these are regular meetings with people in the incident command structure who are communicating to different government partners, different levels. And then externally, we had 2 places for them. So they appeared in the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics technical reports. There were maybe only 4 of these, and I think they appeared in at least 2. And so these were publicly available, but they were targeted for more of a technical audience. So maybe academics or other modelers, not necessarily the everyday person or the general public. We had another place for that on a different kind of CDC website. And I'll show you kind of what we did for that. But the CDC website was more for the everyday person to just kind of easily check and see what is the situation with Mpox right now. So James showed a bit of plots. So these are the default plots for EpiNow2. And so you have 3 panels. You have cases by date of report, cases by date of infection, and the RT. And so we modified these a little bit for the technical report. So some people didn't like the cases by infection because you don't, or the number of infections by day, because you don't observe them. And so anyway, in our experience, people prefer to see the cases by date of report and the RT. So that's pretty much all we changed. We just removed that middle panel. And then for the publicly available website, we simplified it even further and we just said, okay, RT. So here's the plot of RT with some uncertainty. And we said, if RT is above 1, your epidemic is growing. If it's less than 1, it's decreasing. And if it's 1, it's stable. You're not increasing or decreasing. In addition to the national analyses, we also did sub-national analyses. So this is one by region because the epidemic had different dynamics in different geographical places. So you could see we had split it into four regions. And then we also looked at the most affected states/cities. And that was kind of nice because that's a functionality that's in the package. You can just easily divide it up by region to see differences. And so we also did some performance evaluation, but this was kind of post hoc after the fact. I would have liked to have done this in real time, but there were a lot of competing demands in the future. I would have liked to have done something like this, but after the fact, kind of just for the paper, we wanted to assess how well the forecasts were able to predict the outbreak. And so we chose 8 key dates during 4 outbreak phases where we had those snapshots where we could kind of go through and look at what we had at the time versus what ultimately happened. We used different metrics, particularly weighted interval score, mean absolute error, and prediction interval coverage to determine how well they worked. And then we compared it to a naive or a baseline model for comparison. So ultimately we used a Bayesian GLM with a negative binomial and an indicator for weekend as our comparison. So this is the table that's in the paper, but I kind of just want to draw your attention to the bold, which shows that at the beginning of the outbreak, these early phases, the simpler model did better. It had a lower WIS score, and EpiNow2 started to do better around the exponential growth phase and after. So I guess once we had a little bit more data, it was able to do a bit better. Here's a picture of that. So it shows you the 8 key dates that we used at the different phases and our estimates with the uncertainty around it in blue. So this is for EpiNow2. And then in comparison, you have the GLM. So this, I think, is a different y-axis scale, but you can see there's like a lot of uncertainty at the exponential phase part of the epidemic, which is usually one of the pieces you're most interested in. So some limitations for EpiNow2, I found that there was a steep learning curve. Again, that was 3 years ago. Maybe if I started today, it might be easier. And certainly now that I have outbreak experience, there was some long computational time and strange behavior, especially once we started to move the analyses from running it locally to more into the system that had the data. Ultimately, we abandoned that, but it would have been better if we could have run it on that system, but there were some strange things happening. And the method, at least then, didn't account for under ascertainment, so under reporting, which we know was likely an issue for MPOS. Some key takeaways are that we really strive to have clear and consistent communication about modeling outputs. We had very close collaboration between modelers, epidemiologists, informaticians, and data scientists. And also Sam Abbott made himself available to help us when we had questions, which was really great. Not all package authors are as active in helping their users. So that was great. It was important to understand the data generating process and use appropriate methods. I would say most outbreaks are different in some way, and you can't necessarily use the same thing every time, but ideally we strive to have a methods that's general enough, but ultimately you are going to have things that you're going to have to adapt or change regardless. And keeping in mind that real world data are often imperfect, and so when people are developing methods, it's important for them to consider as many historical outbreaks as possible with different routes of transmission in different regions to account for as many eventualities as possible. Next time, I would like to have better strategies for archiving historical data, particularly for things like estimating right truncation, but also evaluating them after. And I would try to consider alternative models and to compare and have an ensemble. I think if we had more people, if we had more modelers, maybe that would have been possible. But yeah, that's what I learned. So I'll stop there and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Kelly. This was great because I guess what we are trying to do in Epiverse is in some form challenging because we are using open source tools with R. And you just said that it was very difficult, that the government workforce didn't have any or limited experience using R. So it's great to know that what we are doing here, it may be applicable in public health response, but also how you are applying it. So that was a great experience to know about it. We have time for some questions. So you have a Q&A box in the toolbar, so please post your questions over there. Or if you want to say it out loud, please raise your hand and I can give you the floor over. So I'm going to start with, I think this question is for James. How did you update the RT during forecast?
Sorry, what's the question? I didn't hear that.
Oh, how do you update RT during forecast?
Oh, there's quite a number of options. So you can account for susceptible depletion in the forecasting window, for example. There are options to keep the RT constant or to allow a Gaussian process to be used to extrapolate the RT in the forecasting window and so on and so forth. So there are quite a number of options in the forecasting window. I can share a link to the vignette that describes the various options. I hope that's useful.
Great. We have another question that says, thanks for the presentation, James. One question I had after watching both talks is how do you think about developing these types of tools when they are being used around the world, and how does that affect your decision making?
Kelly, do you want to answer that, or should I answer?
I'm not developing the tools, I'm just using the tools. I would find myself at the interface, but I have many discussions with Sam Abbott about this, and I'm going to do a shameless plug for the EpiNow2 community. We have a forum over there where not as many people as Sam would like post on it, and we have monthly seminar series as well on the first Wednesday of every month, which is very much kind of aligned with this real-time modeling stuff. And I think you just need more dialogue between the people developing the tools and the people using the tools. The problem is you don't always have transparency. So I think maybe one reason why I really had to push through this paper, this nowcasting paper. It was a real pain to get published, by the way. So, but I thought it was important because I thought many people are going to be interested in what we did. And I think it's going to inform future outbreaks and future kind of uses of tools in a public health agency context. So anyway, I would just say, yeah, more dialogue and more kind of exchange between kind of end users or whoever you're targeting and the people making the tools.
Yeah, I would add that I think quite often these tools are initially developed to solve people's personal problems, and then other people
Their
find them
personal
useful.
problems.
Yeah, so
maybe they're professional problems, not their personal problems.
personal, professional problems. So EpiNow2, for example, was developed around the time when there was a bit of frustration around people using wrong methods to estimate RT during COVID. And there was a need for a better tool. And so it was just out of frustration using existing tools. And I think if I remember correctly, I joined later on, about 2 years after it was developed. But one of the original issues was that the existing tools were not adaptable enough. So if you wanted to change it for your own problem, you needed to recode the whole model from scratch. And so one of the solutions was to develop a tool that depended on a code base that could be changed. So EpiNow2, for example, is built on Stan. And so basically you can take, and it has been, the Stan backend has been reused many times in other packages. You can basically just fork the EpiNow2 package and change the Stan model and use it for, and add your own improvements, for example. So that is one of the answers I think I can give. And for Epiverse TRACE, for example, some of the tools we developed were out of clear needs from COVID and other outbreaks for example, simulating new data for testing methods, or for developing a package for that collates parameter estimates so that you don't have to go back to the literature to extract these values. And so it's often just to solve a problem that people have recognized.
I was going to say, I see another question in the chat by Iman. So if I have a measles line list, can I do the forecast depending on onset date and notification date instead of serial interval? So if you have onset date and notification date, you need 2 delays there. You need your reporting delay, so the time from onset to notification, and you need the serial interval. So that's your time from infection to onset, or rather you need a couple delays in here. You need the incubation period. Within, maybe James, do you want to explain? So you do need those dates, but you need additional delays. You still will need your serial interval.
For some reason, I
You see
can't
that
find
one?
the Q&A.
It's in the chat. If I have a measles line list.
Oh,
So yes, you
so I
can, but
do the
you
forecast
just
depending
need
on
more
onset date.
delays.
Oh yeah, I think some people have used onset dates, but you need to be aware of the limitations of doing that, for example. So using the onset dates instead of the serial interval. Oh, I don't understand what you mean by the serial interval here, because the serial interval is the paired onset dates between primary infections and secondary infections, and we have other tools that allow you to estimate that distribution. So, for example, the epinowcast tools that Kelly has mentioned can be used to estimate that distribution, which you can then pass to packages like EpiNow2.
Are there
Thank
other
you so much
questions?
for those. We have another question, and it says, great presentation, Kelly. From your experience, of difficulties using the tools? What do you think is something that should be changed or widely advised for future outbreak response that involve multiple teams or multiple countries collaborating?
That's a good question. At least in the Mpox outbreak, though it was affecting other countries, we didn't collaborate as much as, say, I would like with those other countries. We just kind of waited for them to it was more passive. You'd wait for a team to put out data or estimates for, say, a delay, and then we would use it in our work. But I would say some of the connections were more informal. So we would just kind of, there were some calls. I think there were some calls with, say, the Public Health Agency of Canada. There might have been some with UKHSA, but it seemed like it was a bit higher up. So I was in the modeling team, so I wasn't leading the modeling team, but I think that maybe my boss may have had a bit more interaction with those other teams. So yeah, but in a lot of ways, you are quite restricted working for the government, particularly around data sharing. So we're always trying to make that better, but just to maintain patient privacy and to stay within the regulations and laws, you are often quite limited in terms of what you can share in terms of data.
Great, thank you, Kelly. I think in the interest of time, a few takeaways I have in here are collaboration is essential for developing these tools and also for applying these in real world scenarios. We also need these tools to be user-centered because of the challenges that we find every day with the data that we are managing. So now I want to invite you. We have come to an end. If you have any comments, questions, please let us know. I want to invite you to two things that will happen. So we value your feedback, so please help us or let us know how we did. You can scan this QR code and fill up the evaluation form. It will take less than 2 minutes, or we also share a link for the evaluation form in the chat. So you can scan it now. Another thing I want to invite you is we are launching the infectious disease modeling epi training kit for Africa. This is a free and open to all resource that we have built with Javeriana University, Epiverse, data.org, the MRC Uni in the Gambia, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which is contextualized to the African region. So we are also sharing the link in the chat where you can register for this launching, which is on the 28th of August, and you can register now. Please go and see the experts and collaborators of our training materials and how they develop this. And finally, I would like to thank James and Kelly for participating in these spaces or these venues that we are creating to support our community while they're using our tools, while they are training themselves to provide better response for public health crisis in their own countries. So thank you so much, Kelly and James. I hope to see you again soon. And if you want to stay connected with the Epiverse community, please follow us on our social media channels. They are LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and if you want to be part of the mailing list, please scan the QR or go to the link that we just shared in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone, and I hope to see you in our next session. Bye-bye.